intellectual. He loved to travel. He was so exciting, and he kind of had it all.
They were completely in love. It looked like the perfect relationship.
But Joy soon discovered something lurking beneath that perfect exterior.
I've never seen anything as violent and as horrendous as this.
They were beaten to death. Their throats were slit.
And before long, the only way for Joy to protect herself and her family was to help put the man she loved behind bars.
I was just shaking. I thought, this can't be real. This can't really be happening.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Joy DeSombre wasn't the type of woman who needed a man in her life. The 28-year-old single mom and college student had been down that road before.
I wasn't really interested in dating. When I'd finally gotten out of my first marriage, I was just sort of relieved and happy and very independent, and I had my 2 toddlers. I was moving forward in my life.
Men weren't on Joy's radar until a friend persuaded her to try her hand at online dating.
I met several different men. I just kept being disappointed. Nothing was really special to me about any of these men.
That is, until January 2002, when Joy began chatting with Joseph Kua, who said he was a 48-year-old commercial real estate broker with a degree from a prominent university.
Joseph was so far above and beyond all of the other guys, everything you could ever dream of. Romantic, spontaneous, fun, exciting, intellectual.
The only downside was that Joseph lived in Northern California, about 8 hours from Joy's San Diego home. But he was willing to travel for love. A month later, Joseph came to town and took Joy out on a proper date.
We went to dinner and we stayed there long after other people had already left. We were just having an amazing conversation.
Joseph just seemed to do everything right and say everything right. He asked her a lot of questions about herself, and they seemed immediately taken with each other.
Before long, the two began to date, and Joy noticed how great Joseph was with her children, quickly becoming the father figure they'd never had.
He would do anything they wanted. He was teaching them sports. He was just the all-American dad.
And Joseph seemed to have a disposable income, which he showered on Joy and her children. But exactly how Joseph made his money was a bit of a mystery.
I was never quite sure what Joseph did for a living. When you asked him about his job, he would simply say, "I'm in commercial real estate."
He said specifically, I like to separate my business from my personal life. I make a lot of money, I'm very successful, but it is stressful what I do. And I thought, well, everything else about him is so wonderful. Why am I going to be so picky about this?
So Joy put her concerns aside, and by the fall of 2002, she and Joseph started talking marriage. They planned an intimate ceremony for the following June in Kauai, Hawaii.
He had grown up in Hawaii, and he told me all about it, so we were very excited about that.
Joseph's only wedding guests were going to be his longtime friend and business partner, 75-year-old Fernand Wagner, and his 64-year-old wife, Suzanne.
Joseph said that he had met Fernand, I think about a couple of decades before, and that Fernand had been a really successful restaurateur, and they had partnered up to be in commercial real estate together.
Joseph told Joy he was even the trustee on their will.
They didn't have any children, and Joseph was there for them. He helped them do a lot of things. He was their boy, in a way.
But in February 2003, 4 months before the Wagners were to join Joy and Joseph on their wedding day, Joy received some surprising news.
I got pregnant. So by June, I was about 5 months along, and I couldn't fit into the wedding dress.
The wedding was postponed, but their lives together moved forward with the purchase of a beautiful 4-bedroom home in Southern California. Joy was excited until Joseph told her something odd.
He let me know that his name was going to be the only one on the title because he had a lot more money than I did. I argued with him about that, but he promised me that once we got married, that he'd add my name to the title to the house.
So Joy decided to let the argument go. She felt lucky to have a man like Joseph. But 3 years later, her luck would run out. On June 14, 2006, around 7 p.m., Joseph called Joy from Northern California. He was on his way home and had devastating news.
Hello? Joseph received a phone call from Fernand's nephew that Fernand had been murdered. And I asked about Suzanne, and he said, "Oh, she's dead too." I was so shocked. I said, oh my God, I can't believe this could have happened. And he acted like it was no big deal.
Joy assumed that Joseph was in shock, but when he arrived home later that evening, he seemed eerily calm.
Got on the computer, emailed some of the friends and family members of the Wagners. So sorry to hear that this has happened. And then he went to the gym.
The next morning, Joy slowly rolled over in bed and noticed something even more strange.
His hand was very badly swollen and purple, and you could see the blood right under the skin. Something seemed and felt desperately wrong.
In October 2003, 3 years before Joy DeSombre learned that her husband's business partners had been murdered, she and Joseph were celebrating the birth of a beautiful baby girl.
We agreed that we would name her Kauai, since that was the island where we were supposed to get married, so that was really special to us.
With a new baby, a destination wedding no longer seemed feasible. But 2 months later, Joseph had a surprise for Joy.
Joseph said, "Why don't we get married now? We'll go to Vegas." He said, "I'll just fly your parents out, and now we can make it official."
Joy was thrilled, and a week before Christmas, she and Joseph read their vows in a small chapel in Las Vegas.
He talked about how he had found his soulmate. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard.
Over the next year, the couple thrived as Joy took a job as an auto adjuster, and Joseph worked hard to provide for his new family.
He always seemed to have money for anything we wanted to do. We took nice vacations. We had a couple of boats. We definitely were living, I thought, the nice life.
But Joseph was still working 8 hours away in Northern California, and the distance between the newlyweds was beginning to wear on Joy.
Every time we planned a vacation, he would end up shortening it at the last minute because he'd have to race back up north for business. He never had a set schedule.
Joy began to worry that there might be other reasons why Joseph was away so much.
He would say I couldn't call him sometimes in the morning because he claimed he was out golfing with friends. I thought for sure that he was probably with someone else.
It didn't seem that he'd have any inclination to cheat because he seemed completely devoted to Joy and to the children.
Everybody reminded me, well, he does all these amazing things for you. I couldn't help but think, wow, maybe I am just being too nitpicky.
But in January 2005, just over a year into their marriage, Joy received a phone call that confirmed her deepest fear.
A woman from Northern California called me. She said that she had been seeing Joseph for the last 2 years.
She told Joy he had actually signed a domestic partnership with this woman, which in California is the same as a marriage.
According to the other woman, Joseph had described Joy as a crazy, strung-out addict with whom he'd had a one-night stand and a baby.
I responded that I was gainfully employed, that I didn't do drugs, that these things weren't true. I was just really blown away.
Joy immediately called Joseph and confronted him, but it was like talking to a stranger.
He said that it was my fault that he found her in the first place. He didn't have these small children running around like at our home. And it was more peaceful for him to go there. I couldn't believe that he let it go like that.
I felt so bad for her. My heart just ached. She was hysterical. She was sad. She was angry.
Joy wanted out of the marriage, but Joseph threatened that if she left, he would fight her for custody of Kauai and win. And there was something very unsettling about the tone of his voice.
I could almost feel it in my body, this horrible, hollowed out darkness. It was almost like the feeling of evil.
In the winter of 2005, after discovering Joseph's infidelity, Joy DeSombre wanted out of her marriage, but knew she was trapped.
He would remind me that if I left, I would have nothing. He would say, "You'll be a bad mother, I can prove it in court, I can get full custody of Kauai, you'll probably lose your other 2 children." He was always threatening.
So Joy came up with a plan to prepare herself for an inevitable divorce and did what she could to squirrel money away to her mother.
I could probably only send her $50, $100, maybe $150. Frankly, it probably would have taken a decade to get enough money together for a divorce attorney.
In the meantime, Joy resolved to keep the peace in the marriage.
I knew that I had to wait and just be patient to be able to build up enough money to have a decent divorce and provide a good life for my children.
Then that June, Joseph contacted Joy's father about visiting their home in Des Moines, Iowa with Kauai.
I think that my parents had planned on continuing a relationship with him even if we did get divorced, because, you know, he is Kauai's father and he did do a lot of things with her.
But at the last minute, Joseph canceled the trip.
He said the reason was business. There was a bounce check in the Bay Area. And how do you take care of a bounce check? That's something that's taken care of by your bank.
A few days later, on June 14th, 2006, Joseph called Joy with some horrible news. He said Fernand and Suzanne Wagner had been shot to death in their home.
I just had tears rolling down my cheeks. I didn't know how to accept this. I was so in shock, I just didn't even know how to take it.
We didn't know what had happened. My first concern is that they were all in danger, possibly. It could be a situation where Joseph and Ferdinand had made somebody angry. They got Ferdinand and they're going to be after Joseph next, or his family.
Joy fully expected Joseph to remain up north to handle things for his dear friends. Instead, he told her he was planning to swing by one of his boats and would be back in San Diego later in the evening.
And he said, "I'll get up there later on after the will is read. They're not going to do anything yet." And so it was about the will. It wasn't about them.
Meanwhile, investigators in Millbrae, California were busy trying to solve the Wagners' murders.
I've never seen anything as violent and as horrendous as this. I see 2 lifeless people laying there, people who were, coming into their golden years of their life. It shook me to the core.
At first, it appeared that the Wagners were victims of a robbery and sexual assault.
There are drawers open all around us. In the area where the bodies were located was Mrs. Wagner's underwear balled up on the couch nearby.
But something didn't add up. As investigators dug a little deeper, they uncovered evidence that suggested the killer might be someone the Wagners knew.
There didn't appear to be any kind of forced entry. So immediately we're thinking maybe the person that had done this knew the family.
Meanwhile, when Joseph arrived home later that night, it was business as usual.
He showed up at the house a couple hours later with fast food in his hand, sat down, ate his fast food, got on the computer, and then he went to the gym. He came home after the gym and went to bed and slept like a baby.
On June 15th, the following morning, Joy rolled over in bed and noticed something odd. Joseph was covered with bruises and cuts. But when Joy questioned Joseph, he had an explanation for everything.
He told me that the bruise on his shin he got while he was rollerblading, and that the horrible bruising on his hand was from a refrigerator falling on it. And I couldn't help but think, there's something wrong with these stories.
The following day, Joy headed out to meet Joseph on one of their boats with the kids, when her mom called with some shocking news.
I said they just released the cause of death. The Wagners were not shot in the head.
She held the phone out and played a live stream on their computer from a newscast, and it said that they'd been beaten to death. And that's when I knew. And I said, "I know he did it. He's covered in bruises. he's the murderer.
The world stopped. For just a minute, you can't catch your breath. What on earth are we going to do now? She's on her way to meet a man that she knows murdered somebody.
I was terrified. I was crying. I was pounding on the desk. I was so frightened that something would happen to her.
Joy knew she couldn't risk letting on that she suspected Joseph was a killer.
I knew the best thing to do was to go right into the eye of the storm and put on the best acting job of my life. I was going to sleep on a boat with my 3 children next to a brutal murderer.
Years into her marriage, Joy DeSombre was suddenly terrified that her husband would discover that she knew he was a killer. So she met him on the boat as planned.
And we drove on to the marina. We acted like everything was normal.
Meanwhile, Joy's mother called the tip line, but all she got was resistance.
The individual who answered the phone simply said, "This is out of my jurisdiction."
For the next 24 hours, Joy stayed with Joseph and kept up her act, hoping he wouldn't turn his rage on her and the kids.
And I continued to be the supportive wife for him, and I was terrified.
We didn't know if they'd be safe. We didn't know what would happen during the night.
Later that day, on June 17th, Joseph told Joy he was heading back upstate. Joy headed straight to the police.
I called the detectives, and they had been looking for him all week. That's when I found out that they knew very early on that he was a person of interest.
Police put out an APB on Joseph's truck, and it wasn't long before he was spotted at another marina in Southern California. Police immediately took him into custody.
I felt so much relief that he'd been caught, and our daughter and our grandchildren weren't going to be in danger.
Police charged Joseph with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances for multiple murder. And the more investigators dug up about Joseph's life, the less Joy realized she knew about her own husband.
I found out that he was not business partners with Fernand, that he was merely a maintenance man for them. And they were paying him $525 a month for a few hours of work to collect rent checks and do some minor maintenance. He had been skimming from rent checks and keeping the money for himself, moving money from accounts, kiting checks. I was so shocked. I was devastated.
Investigators believed that by the spring of 2006, Joseph had embezzled more than $200,000 from the Wagners, and Fernand finally figured it out.
Fernand Wagner confronted Joseph Kua in his house. I think he told Joseph that knew he was stealing money from him, and he wasn't going to put up with it anymore. And something snapped in Joseph Kua's mind.
And Joseph was particularly enraged. Fernand's throat was cut. Suzanne had been strangled. Both the Wagners were brutally beaten.
He couldn't have boats and houses and cars and travel without the Wagners' money. His life, as he knew it, was over, and I think he just lost it.
Joseph himself had racked up tens of thousands of dollars in credit card debt and made faulty claims on his income taxes, leaving Joy to pick up the pieces.
The vehicles were repossessed. The house was foreclosed upon. This was emotionally and financially devastating.
On June 2nd, 2008, Joseph went to trial and pleaded not guilty.
Joseph has never admitted guilt. He claims that he's innocent and that a third party murdered the Wagners.
On June 27th, 2008, Joseph Kua was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder.
I was so excited and so relieved. My children and I could be free of this person, and we didn't have to be afraid anymore.
On December 18th, 2008, Joy and Joseph's 5-year wedding anniversary, Joseph was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Their divorce was finalized in March 2009.
I think Joy is probably stronger than she was. She's paid a heavy price for this strength, But I think she's going to be okay.
Today, Joy and her children live with her parents and are slowly picking up the pieces.
My kids are just amazingly strong, and they're always there for me. And I hope that I've been a good example to them in how to turn this around in a positive way.
Joy is happy. She's hopeful. She's well-adjusted. She has taken a whole new direction in her life.
I'm moving on and using this as a lesson so that I can help educate others and so that I can do something really positive with what has happened in our lives. I'm not interested in dating again or getting married or anything like that or becoming serious with anybody. I think my children are significant enough, and that's, I think, how I'll live the rest of my life.
Biggest memory in life was when my son was born.
And that was a tremendously joyful occasion for both of them.
But Leanne had plans of her own for the marriage.
His wife fled with the baby.
And when her deception turned deadly,
The wrong man was killed.
Paul found himself caught in the crosshairs of a sinister plot.
It was such a sensational case.
It was like, oh my God, could she really be this devious?
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Paul Rydell's first love was purely physical.
Football was my first passion. I think I was always blessed athletically and put so much into it because that's where I got to bring my feelings out.
But Paul's brawny exterior was hiding an unhappy past.
I never knew my dad, and my dad left when I was young. And my mother, I felt like she resented me or didn't like me. It defined me in a sense. I was constantly looking for approval from her.
In the fall of 1998, Paul was 29 years old and living alone in Amityville, New York. He was determined to put his troubles behind him, with a little help from his best friend and workout partner, Alex Algieri.
He was kind of the opposite of me. He was very mellow, very laid back, and we just really blended well together.
Alex and Paul were not only the closest of friends, but they actually had a similar physical appearance. They both had dark hair. They both drove the same car.
We were with each other every minute of every day for years.
The two friends were also successful entrepreneurs, having just opened one of the country's first 24-hour fitness centers.
At that time, the concept really wasn't there, so we were very successful, and that's when the fitness craze was really starting to take off.
That winter, Paul was riding high on his success. And while he wasn't looking for love, he certainly had his fair share of admirers. One in particular was 26-year-old Leanne Armanini, a single mother who worked at a local bar.
She had a son, maybe about 11, 12, and I think that's one of the things that kind of gravitated me towards her, the nurturing part.
After a few casual dinners, Paul and Leanne began to date. A year later, when Leanne realized she was pregnant, Paul decided it was a good time to take the relationship to the next level. When the couple tied the knot that July, it was a true shotgun wedding.
It was a really nice wedding. I had two best men, and Alex was one of them.
7 months later, the couple's son Nicholas was born.
Nicholas's birth changed Paul's entire view of life. For the first time, I think, Paul truly experienced what real love is like.
I started learning how great it feels to give more than it is to get. He's just the most amazing human being.
But before Nicholas turned 1 year old, tragedy struck, and Paul's entire life changed forever. It all started the evening of January 17th, 2001, while Paul was taking a few hard-earned hours away from the gym.
A friend of mine wanted to go out to dinner, so I asked Al to cover for me. Started having drinks, started saying no. I never ended up going back to work.
At about 10 that evening, Paul's cell phone began to ring.
So I picked it up. It was Leanne frantic, telling me about Alex. The guy Alex got shot.
The news hit like a ton of bricks. Alex Algieri, Paul's friend and business partner, had been gunned down in the parking lot of their gym.
I couldn't believe it. And Al didn't argue or fight with anybody. You know, he was a very easygoing guy. It didn't make no sense it would be Al.
Paul was devastated and confused, but his wife Leanne was terrified.
This execution-style murder has all the markings of a mafia hit. A small-caliber weapon at night, shots to the head.
While Alex had no enemies to speak of, Paul's reputation as a tough guy was well known. Leanne was certain the bullets were not meant for Alex, but for her husband.
Leanne comes to Paul and says, not only are you in danger, but I'm in danger as your wife, and more importantly, the baby's in danger.
Was this tragedy a case of mistaken identity?
The very first thing that Paul did was come here and have me draft a will, leaving everything that he owned to Leanne.
In the spring of 2000, 9 months before his best friend and business partner was murdered, Paul Rydell was struggling to adjust to his young marriage with Leanne.
First couple months are okay. You know, I started going back out with my friends, like a live party with my friends, coming home real late. I was still very young.
On the outside, Paul had much to celebrate. His 24-hour gym was booming, and he and his partner, Alex Algieri, had achieved enormous success.
My life, as far as I was concerned, was great. I was going out with my friends, business was good, had money.
But behind closed doors, life with Leanne had become somewhat rocky.
It got to the point where she was really tired of me going out and not coming home and doing the things I needed to do.
So one day that June, while Paul was away from home, Leanne took matters into her own hands.
A friend of mine goes to my house to visit me and he calls me up. He goes, Paul, there's 2 moving trucks in your house. They're emptying out and they're moving out your house.
Stunned, Paul immediately raced home. But it was too late. Leanne had made up her mind to move to Florida and start a new life with her mother. Nothing Paul said would stop her.
I think she probably got fed up and said, I'm leaving. I'm going to Florida. And at that point, I was okay with us not being married or getting a divorce.
But the game changer for Paul was Leanne's determination to take their infant son, Nicholas, with her.
At that very moment, life changed for me. I realized, wow, this is real. I'm going to lose my son. I went to see a lawyer. I didn't know what else to do.
Paul's case ultimately found its way to my desk. And during my initial meeting with him, he was overwrought with fear, not about the fact that his wife had left him, but about the fact that the baby was gone.
Steve immediately got to work, and it wasn't long before he realized Leanne was breaking the law.
The general rule is that one spouse who has custody of a child can simply not unilaterally pack up and move to a distant domicile without either the permission of the other spouse or leave of court. The court directed her to return with the child within 20 days or face the loss of custody.
It was a quick victory for Paul. That July, Leanne headed back to New York, Nicholas in tow.
I just wanted to have a relationship with my son, and you can't have a relationship with your child 2,000 miles away.
A divorce proceeding had been scheduled for November 21st. But on that day, things took a surprising turn.
I arrived in court a little bit early. I was setting up at the table, and I heard the door open up, and I turned around, and I saw Paul come walking in, holding the baby, and Leanne behind him pushing a stroller.
Steve was stunned.
I looked at Paul and he said, listen, I want you to withdraw this. We work things out. And I said to him, listen, wait a minute. We can adjourn this. We can postpone this. But withdrawing this is a significant thing.
But Paul stood firm. He and Leanne wanted the divorce withdrawn.
I knew that I could do better. And I was seeing what I lost I was ready to try and do that. Absolutely, I was ready to really try and do that.
Despite his misgivings, Steve withdrew the proceeding, while Paul and Leanne set about making amends.
At that point, I just wanted to work. I wanted to be with my son.
Meanwhile, back at the office, Steve couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. In particular, he was bothered by an affidavit Leanne had filed upon her return to New York.
Before we conducted the hearing, Leanne filed opposition papers designed to convince the judge that she should not be forced to come back to New York. One of the reasons that she detailed for leaving was her contention that she was advised that there was a mafia contract out on Paul's life. Now, Paul was not, and he has never been, involved with any organized crime faction.
While Leanne's suspicions seemed questionable, Steve would soon learn she was onto something.
The first thing that I thought was, oh my God, she's right.
But he could never have guessed how it would all play out. Disaster was just on the horizon.
Everything happened so fast and the wrong man was killed.
In January 2001, Paul Rydell was doing his best to be a good husband to Leanne.
I was putting more of an effort into making things better. I was just trying to be a better husband, and I felt like it was working and we were getting along better.
But Leanne didn't seem entirely comfortable.
There would be times when Leanne would say, Paul, I'm going to run to the store, just keep an eye on the baby. And one of Paul's friends would drop by and say, listen, your wife is on the payphone at the corner. What's going on?
I confronted her about it. And she says, it's my mother. I really got to ease into this slowly with my mother. She's giving me a hard time.
The explanation made sense. Paul knew Leanne's mother wasn't very fond of him, but he had very little time to dwell on that problem. Just 2 weeks later, he was blindsided by one of the worst tragedies of his life. The evening of January 17th, 2001, Paul was at dinner with a friend when Leanne called him with terrible news. Alex Algieri had been shot execution-style in the parking lot of their gym.
Alex Algieri went outside to his SUV to get some CDs. Unbeknownst to him, there were two men waiting in a car. Shots rang out in very quick succession, and Alex stumbled back into the gym, muttered, "I've been shot," to a witness, and died a few minutes later.
The killers fled the scene, leaving no evidence behind. Paul was devastated.
It didn't make no sense. What type of man sneaks behind somebody like that with a gun?
The following days were tough, but there was one person who stood by Paul's side, his wife, Leanne.
She was the one person that I felt that I could talk to, and she was the person I was leaning on. She went to the funeral with me. She never cried. I was always wondering why she didn't cry.
Meanwhile, as the investigation into Alex's murder picked up steam, a frightening theory began to take shape.
Paul came to the conclusion, as did I, and as did the police themselves, that this homicide was a mistake, that the intended victim was clearly Paul.
For Leanne, the thought was terrifying.
Leanne comes back to Paul and says, there really was a mafia contract on your life, and it's still out there.
She begged Paul to let her go back to Florida and take Nicholas with her.
So I told her, listen, let's figure this out. Get your stuff together, go to Florida. Take the baby, go to Florida.
Meanwhile, Paul stayed behind and began to prepare for the worst.
I went into Steve's office and I made a will of leaving everything to Leanne, thinking that she would make sure that that money was there for Nicholas when he got older.
Over the next 2 months, Paul shuttled back and forth between New York and Florida, juggling family and business. Before long, Leanne told Paul she was pregnant again.
He was overjoyed. The concept of being the father that he never had is what dominated his entire being.
But Paul's happiness would soon fade. Several weeks later, during one of his trips to Florida, a family friend gave Paul some unsettling news.
He goes, I gotta talk to you. He goes, you know, every time you leave, she goes out with this guy, Rocco. I went home and I confronted her. I'm like, who's this guy, Rocco? And she literally dropped.
Leanne claimed Rocco was just a friend, but Paul wasn't buying it.
I said, you know what? I said, I'm leaving. I left, went home.
Shortly after Paul returned to New York, Leanne made an unexpected move. She served Paul with divorce papers.
To commence a divorce action in Florida, all you have to show is that you've lived in Florida for 6 consecutive months. Well, 2 weeks after she met the 6-month residency requirement, Leanne filed an action for divorce against Paul in Florida. And now, Nicholas has lived in Florida for 6 months with our consent, and now we can't get him back.
On December 24th, 2001, when Leanne gave birth to another baby boy, she refused to let Paul see him.
I was calling around hospitals and trying to find out where the baby was, and nobody would tell me anything.
It seemed Paul was on the verge of losing everything once again. To make matters worse, Alex's murder remained unsolved.
I was emotionally spent. I went to kind of a depression, and that was bad. That was really bad.
But things were about to take a surprising turn.
And I get a call from Paul, who's absolutely frantic. And he says, I caught the murderer, she's involved.
And when the whole twisted story came out, it shocked everyone.
I'm like, how did I not put this together?
It was like being hit in the face with a 100-pound dumbbell.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. By spring 2002, Paul Rydell knew his marriage to Leanne was over. But his son Nicholas weighed heavily on his mind.
I wasn't upset about me and her. At this time, I was just upset about Nicholas. I didn't know how I was going to see Nicholas.
In addition, the murder of Paul's best friend, Alex Algieri, was no closer to being solved.
I think that the most overcoming emotion has always been dealing with that Alex died.
But everything was about to change. In November 2001, more than a year after Alex was shot, police got a surprising and unexpected break when they arrested a suspect for grand larceny.
Part of the NYPD's normal regimen with every arrest is they debrief the suspect as to their knowledge of other crimes.
The suspect claimed to have knowledge of Alex's murder. The information he gave detectives led them to a Florida bodybuilder named Ralph Salerno, also known as Rocco. It was the very same Rocco Leanne had claimed was just a friend. Police immediately took Rocco in for questioning. And it wasn't long before he spilled the whole twisted truth.
Salerno made a very incriminating statement to the police. He basically made a statement where he confessed to the crime and implicated Leanne in the conspiracy and described driving from Florida to New York with an accomplice with the sole purpose of shooting Paul Rydell to death.
Investigators discovered that Rocco and Leanne had been having an affair in Florida. But that was just the beginning. It seemed Leanne wanted to use Rocco for much more than just dating.
I think very early on, once she was directed by the judge to come back to New York so that Paul could exercise his visitation rights with Nicholas, she realized the only way I'm going to be able to leave New York is either with Paul's consent, which there's no way he's going to give to me, or if Paul is killed.
And with Rocco's help, that's allegedly what Leanne set out to do. She gave Rocco a photo of Paul, but that fateful night, Rocco and his crony mistook Alex for Paul and shot him dead.
Leanne reportedly called Salerno a a bleeping idiot, and told him he killed the wrong guy.
To top it all off, Leanne's newborn son, the baby Paul thought was his, was actually Rocco's.
I found out by the news being on my front lawn. They were like, what do you think about your ex-wife being pregnant by the guy who just got arrested for killing your best friend? I was like, what? That's how I found out. I had no idea. I thought it was my kid.
It was like being hit in the face with 100-pound dumbbell. I mean, it was like, oh my God, could she really be this devious?
In March 2003, Leanne Rydell was arrested at her home in Florida.
It was bittersweet. My first feeling has always been the effect that it had on Nicholas.
On April 24, 2004, Leanne was found guilty of first-degree murder for orchestrating the killing. She was sentenced to 25 years to life. Today, Paul is the father he always set out to be. He has full custody of Nicholas. He also has a new daughter and a wife he loves. He tries not to dwell on the past.
You can go forward or you can go backwards, and backwards is nowhere where I want to be. Backwards is a dark place. I want to move forward. I want to move forward. I want to think about all the wonderful things that I got with my wife, all the wonderful things I got with my children. I don't go backwards.
But one part of Paul's past he'll never forget, his best friend Alex.
I miss him dearly. He'll always be my best friend. But God, how our friendship would have been greater now, because I would have gave him back as much as he gave me.
At 3:17 a.m., the phone rang in a quiet California neighborhood that had learned to sleep with its doors unlocked. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. By the time the line went dead, a woman was already gone, and a town that believed it knew itself was about to lose that certainty forever. No sirens yet. No flashing lights. Just a single porch light burning through the fog, illuminating a driveway that would soon become an image burned into collective memory. This was not the kind of place where people disappeared. This was not the kind of place where a cold case would be born. And yet, by sunrise, that was exactly what it had become. Her name was Laura Whitman, 32 years old, a nurse, known for double shifts and quiet generosity. She lived alone in a small beige house on Alder Street, the kind of street where lawns were trimmed evenly and neighbors waved without really knowing each other. On the night she vanished, her car was parked neatly in the driveway. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter. The television was still on, volume low, a late-night news anchor frozen mid-sentence. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, just absence, the kind that feels deliberate, calculated, wrong. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was crawling with police. Yellow tape stretched across driveways that had never seen it before. Officers moved slowly, carefully, as if sound itself might disturb whatever fragile truth remained inside that house. Detectives noted the details that didn't scream for attention but whispered instead. The back door unlocked. A faint scuff mark on the hallway wall. A glass in the sink, rinsed but not put away. And outside, along the side fence, a patch of grass pressed down as if someone had knelt there. Or waited. The first headlines came fast and blunt. Nurse missing in suburban California. Then sharper. Police fear foul play. By the third day, the phrase that changes everything appeared in print. Cold case in the making. The community recoiled at the words. Cold case meant time. Cold case meant unanswered questions. Cold case meant that whatever happened to Laura Whitman might never be explained. Search teams fanned out across nearby woods, drainage canals, and abandoned lots. Helicopters cut slow circles through the sky. Volunteers held flyers with her smiling photo, the edges already curling in the sun. Tips flooded in. A woman walking her dog heard a scream. A man driving home late saw headlights that didn't belong. None of it led anywhere. Each promising lead collapsed under scrutiny, leaving behind only frustration and a growing sense of unease. Inside the Whitman house, forensic teams worked with what little they had. A partial fingerprint on the refrigerator handle. Fibers on the couch that didn't match anything she owned. A single long hair caught in the shower drain, later determined not to be hers. In 1995, DNA testing was slow, expensive, and far from definitive. Samples were collected, cataloged, and stored away with cautious optimism. Maybe one day technology would catch up. Maybe one day answers would emerge from evidence sealed in plastic bags. Detectives focused first on the obvious. Ex-boyfriends, coworkers, patients who had grown too attached. Each was questioned. Each denied involvement. Alibis were checked, rechecked, and in most cases, quietly confirmed. There was no history of threats, no restraining orders, no signs that Laura feared anyone. Her life, on paper, was stable, predictable, which only deepened the mystery. People don't just vanish from stable lives. Not without help. Neighbors were interviewed next. Doors opened reluctantly. Stories spilled out in fragments. A late-night argument, maybe. A strange car parked too long. A shadow moving between houses. One neighbor mentioned hearing footsteps on gravel around midnight. Another recalled seeing Laura talking to someone near the side gate earlier that evening, though the face was never clear. The descriptions were vague, inconsistent, unreliable. Memory under pressure has a way of reshaping itself. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The search scaled back. The news trucks left. Flowers wilted on the front porch. The Whitman house stood empty, blinds drawn, a silent accusation in the middle of Alder Street. Inside the police department, Laura's file grew thicker, but no closer to resolution. Leads dried up. Evidence stalled. The case slipped, slowly and painfully, into that dreaded category. Cold. Years passed. New families moved into the neighborhood. Children rode bikes past a house whose history they didn't know. Detectives retired. Files were boxed up, labeled, and shelved. But the case never fully disappeared. It lingered. In late-night conversations. In unanswered emails from Laura's sister. In the quiet discomfort of officers who still remembered the way that house felt when they first walked in. Every few years, the case resurfaced. A new detective with fresh eyes. A new lab technique. A renewed promise that this time would be different. The stored evidence was re-examined. The hair, the fibers, the partial print. Each time, the result was the same. Inconclusive. Insufficient. Another dead end added to a growing list. What haunted investigators most was not what they found, but what they didn't. No body. No crime scene saturated with violence. No clear moment where everything went wrong. Just a woman stepping out of her ordinary life and never stepping back in. It suggested precision. Familiarity. Someone who knew the rhythms of the house. Someone who didn't need to force their way inside. By the late 2000s, the phrase California 1995 cold case had become shorthand within the department. A reminder of limits. Of patience. Of the thin line between solvable and lost forever. Younger officers learned the case as a cautionary tale. Do everything right, and still sometimes you lose. And yet, even as years piled on, one detail refused to fade into the background. Laura's nearest neighbor. A man who lived just 20 feet away. Quiet. Polite. Always home. He had been interviewed early on, like everyone else. He had waved at officers from his porch. Offered bottled water. Said he hadn't heard a thing. At the time, there was no reason to look twice. No record. No red flags. Just another face in a neighborhood full of them. The case slept. Not dead. Just waiting. Waiting for a moment when the past and the future would collide in a way no one could predict. Waiting for science to catch up with silence. Waiting for a truth that had been hiding in plain sight since the very beginning. The file didn't scream for attention when it was pulled from the archive room shelf, but it carried weight, the kind that settles into your hands before you even open it, thick with dust and unfinished business, the kind of cold case that makes detectives pause just a second longer than usual, because reopening it means reopening failure, reopening questions that never stopped echoing, reopening a night in 1995 that refused to stay buried, and when the folder labeled Whitman, Laura was laid out. On the metal table under fluorescent lights, the room felt smaller, tighter, as if the past itself had taken a seat nearby and was listening. The new detective assigned to the case hadn't been on the force when Laura vanished. He was a child then, watching evening news with his parents, absorbing fear secondhand, and now, decades later, he studied black and white photographs of a house that still stood, of a woman frozen in time, smiling into a camera unaware that she would become a headline, a mystery, a cautionary tale. He read witness statements written in fading ink, noticed the margins crowded with handwritten notes, question marks, underlines, the frustration of investigators who had circled the same facts over and over without breaking through. He didn't start with theories. He started with a timeline, stripping it down to bare bone. Laura arrived home at 8:42 p.m. A neighbor remembered the sound of her car door closing. At 9:10 p.m., she spoke briefly on the phone with her sister. Nothing unusual. At 10:05 p.m., a convenience store receipt placed her 2 blocks away, buying milk and bread. After that, silence. No outgoing calls. No credit card activity. No sightings confirmed beyond doubt. Somewhere between routine and midnight, Laura Whitman disappeared. The detective focused on what hadn't fit even back then. The lack of forced entry. The calmness of the house. The fact that her shoes were by the door, placed neatly side by side. People don't remove their shoes for strangers. They do it for someone they trust, or at least someone they recognize. That detail had been noted in 1995, then quietly set aside when nothing concrete followed. Now it came back into focus, sharper, heavier. He revisited the witness statements, listening again to taped interviews that crackled with age. Voices hesitated. Memories blurred. But patterns emerged. Multiple neighbors mentioned movement near the side yard that night. Not frantic. Not loud. Purposeful. Someone walking with confidence, not sneaking, not running. Someone who didn't expect to be challenged. Someone who belonged there. The detective drove to Alder Street for the first time on a gray morning that felt deliberately uninviting. The neighborhood had aged, but not dramatically. Trees were taller. Paint was fresher. The Whitman house looked smaller than in the photographs, less ominous in daylight, almost unremarkable. He stood on the sidewalk and counted steps, measured distances, let his eyes trace the lines between properties. 20 feet. That was all that separated Laura's house from the one next door. 20 feet of lawn and fence and silence. The neighbor's house was still occupied, not by the same man, but by a young family who had no idea what once happened so close to where their children slept. The detective didn't knock. Not yet. He walked the perimeter instead, imagining the dark, the quiet, the ease with which someone could cross that space without being seen, without being questioned. It didn't feel like a stretch. It felt obvious. Uncomfortably so. Back at the station, he requested the evidence be re-examined. Every piece. No matter how small. The hair from a shower drain. The fibers from the couch. The partial fingerprint. In 1995, those items had been whispers. Now, with advances in forensic technology, whispers could become voices. The lab technicians handled the evidence carefully, aware of the pressure that came with cold cases reopened. Expectations ran high, but hope was tempered by experience. Most cold cases stayed cold for a reason. Weeks passed, then months. The detective filled the waiting time by reconstructing Laura's life, not as a victim, but as a person. Her routines, her habits, the routes she walked, the people she smiled at but never truly knew. He discovered she was friendly but private, generous but guarded. She didn't let many people close, but she was polite to everyone, including her neighbors. One name surfaced repeatedly in the old notes. Mark Ellison, the man next door in 1995. 38 years old at the time. Single. worked irregular hours as a freelance repairman. Described by neighbors as quiet, helpful, forgettable. He had been interviewed twice back then, his statements brief, cooperative, unremarkable. He said he had been home all night, watching television, asleep by 11. No one could contradict him. No one could confirm him either. Ellison had moved away 3 years after Laura vanished. No forwarding address listed in the file. Just a scribbled note. Left state, no further contact. At the time, it meant nothing. People moved. Lives went on. Now, it felt like a loose end tugging insistently at the fabric of the case. The lab results arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, quiet, almost anticlimactic in their delivery. The hair recovered from the shower drain had yielded a partial DNA profile. In the 90s, it hadn't matched anything. Today, the national database was exponentially larger. The technician's voice was careful, restrained. There was a potential familial match. Not a direct hit, but close enough to raise eyebrows. Close enough to warrant further digging. The detective felt the familiar tightening in his chest. This was the moment cold cases either collapsed again or cracked open. A familial match suggested a relative of the source had been in the system. Someone had left a trail, however faint. The detective followed it methodically, tracing the genetic markers through public records, arrest logs, distant cousins, half-brothers, a web of connections stretching across states and decades. One name rose to the surface. Mark Ellison. The room went quiet when the connection was confirmed. Not a slam dunk. Not yet. But the statistical probability was enough to turn suspicion into focus. Ellison had a cousin arrested in the early 2000s for an unrelated offense. His DNA entered into the system. The markers aligned. Not perfectly, but disturbingly close. Ellison himself had never been arrested. No criminal record. No DNA on file. A ghost, legally speaking. The detective leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, letting the implications settle. The quiet neighbor. The helpful man. 20 feet away. Always home. They found Ellison living under a slightly altered name in a different state, working the same kind of odd jobs, blending into another neighborhood where no one asked questions. Surveillance photos showed a man older now, heavier, grayer, but unmistakably the same. The detective studied his face, searching for something, guilt, menace, a crack in the facade, but photographs rarely tell the truth. They just freeze the lie. An interview was scheduled under the pretense of routine questioning. Ellison agreed immediately. He always did. The recording captured the sound of chairs scraping, the hum of the air conditioner, the calm rhythm of a man who believed he had nothing to fear. He spoke slowly, carefully. He remembered Laura. Of course he did. Everyone did. He repeated his old story with impressive consistency. Home all night. Television. Asleep. Shocked when he heard she was missing. Tragic. Unbelievable. The detective asked about the side yard. Ellison shrugged. Asked about footsteps. He smiled faintly. Neighborhood noises, he said. Asked about knowing Laura well. Not really. Just neighbors. Friendly hellos. Nothing more. Then the detective mentioned the DNA. The change was subtle. A pause half a second too long. A swallow. A shift in posture. Ellison's voice didn't break, but something tightened beneath it. He asked what DNA. From where? The detective didn't answer directly. He didn't have to. Silence did the work for him, filling the room with possibilities Ellison couldn't control. The interview ended without an arrest. Without a confession. Without closure. But when Ellison walked out, the air felt different. Charged. As if the case, dormant for decades, had just taken its first real breath. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The detective watched Ellison drive away, knowing that the distance between suspicion and proof was still vast, but no longer abstract. This was no longer a faceless mystery. It had an address. A name. A history that intersected too neatly with Laura Whitman's final night. The cold case was warming up. And somewhere in the evidence room, the past shifted, restless, aware that it was being hunted again. The problem with reopening a cold case isn't finding a suspect. It's proving that time hasn't eaten the truth alive, because memories decay, evidence degrades, and lies, if left alone long enough, harden into something that looks almost like fact. And as the investigation narrowed its focus on Mark Ellison, the weight of those decades pressed down harder than ever, turning every step forward into a careful negotiation with the past. The detective didn't rush. Rushing was how cases collapsed. Instead, he rebuilt 1995 inch by inch, hour by hour, forcing the present to bend toward a night that refused to explain itself. He pulled phone records again, not just Laura's this time, but Ellison's, tracing landlines and billing statements archived on microfilm, numbers scribbled in margins, connections that once seemed meaningless. Ellison had made 2 calls that night. One to a repair client earlier in the evening. One after midnight, a brief call to a payphone several blocks away. In 1995, it had gone unnoticed. Now it stood out like a bruise. Payphones were anonymity, made of metal and grime. No caller ID, no camera, just a receiver lifted, words spoken into the dark, and then gone. The detective stared at the record, imagining Ellison stepping out quietly, crossing 20 feet of lawn, slipping back into his house later with no one the wiser. It fit too easily. That was what scared him most. He returned to Alder Street again, this time at night. He parked down the block, engine off, letting the darkness settle around him. Streetlights buzzed softly. A dog barked somewhere distant. He walked the same path witnesses had described, the side yard, the pressed grass now grown back, but still mapped in his mind. From Laura's back door to Ellison's fence, the distance was laughably short. A matter of seconds. No urgency required. No struggle visible from the street. Just familiarity and proximity, doing the work violence didn't need to announce. Inside Laura's house, now occupied by strangers, the detective stood where the kitchen counter had been, aligning old photographs with present walls. The purse would have been here. The shoes there. He pictured her removing them automatically, muscle memory guiding her, unaware that routine was betraying her. Someone she knew. Someone she didn't fear. Someone who didn't need to explain why he was inside her home. The fibers from the couch came back into focus next. Reanalyzed, reclassified. They matched a type of upholstery Ellison had owned at the time, documented in an old insurance claim after a minor flood. It wasn't definitive. It never was. But it stacked on top of everything else, another thin sheet of suspicion laid carefully onto an already heavy pile. The detective reached out to people who had lived on Alder Street in the 90s, tracking them through property records and social media profiles that hadn't existed back then.
Some didn't respond.
Some did, reluctantly, voices cautious, memories stirred like sediment from the bottom of a glass. One woman remembered Ellison more clearly than she expected. He was always outside at odd hours, she said.
Fixing something.
Watching something. Another neighbor recalled seeing him talking to Laura more than once, lingering conversations by the fence that didn't feel alarming at the time, but now carried an uncomfortable weight. None of it was enough. Not for a warrant. Not for an arrest. Cold cases don't hinge on feelings. They hinge on proof. And proof was what time had done its best to erase. The lab called again. This time about the fingerprint. Partial, degraded, once dismissed. New enhancement techniques pulled out additional ridge detail. Not a full print. Never a full print. But enough to compare. Ellison's prints weren't in the system, but the detective had obtained them during the recent interview. Legally, casually, a pen passed across a table, a consent form signed without hesitation. Confidence does that. It convinces people they're untouchable. The comparison didn't yield a match strong enough to stand alone. But it didn't exclude him either. Another almost. Another door half open, half closed. The case was becoming a gallery of near certainties, each one frustrating on its own, devastating when viewed together. Pressure mounted quietly. Cold cases draw attention when they move. Supervisors asked questions. Prosecutors circled, skeptical, cautious. They'd seen this before. Enthusiasm outrunning evidence. Hope outpacing reality. The detective understood their hesitation, but he also felt something he couldn't quite articulate, a sense that this case wasn't cold anymore, just buried under years of polite assumptions. He brought Ellison in again. This time, the room felt different from the start. The small talk was shorter, the pauses longer. Ellison noticed. His smile didn't quite land. The detective laid out pieces, without labeling them accusations. The hair, the fibers, the phone call,
The proximity.
each detail placed gently on the table, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. Ellison listened, nodding, his eyes flicking briefly toward the door before returning to the detective's face. When asked why his DNA might be found in Laura's house, Ellison leaned back and exhaled slowly. He suggested innocent explanations. Borrowed tools. Shared spaces. Accidental transfer. The words came smoothly, rehearsed by someone who had lived with the story for a long time. The detective didn't interrupt. He let the explanations pile up until they began to sag under their own weight. Then he asked a single question, quiet, deliberate. Why had Ellison called a payphone after midnight on the night Laura vanished? The room went still. Ellison's eyes narrowed, just slightly. He asked how the detective knew about that. The answer was simple. Records. But the impact was immediate. The shield Ellison had carried for decades cracked, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to let something darker seep through. He said he couldn't remember. Said it must have been a mistake. Said lots of people used payphones. The interview ended again without handcuffs, but this time, Ellison didn't walk out with the same ease. His shoulders were tighter. His movements more deliberate. The confidence was leaking. The detective watched him go, aware that suspects often make mistakes when they feel watched, when the past they thought was dead starts knocking again. Surveillance followed. Quietly. Legally. Ellison's routines were documented. His habits mapped. He was careful. Too careful. He avoided old neighborhoods. Avoided familiar routes. Avoided anything that might invite memory. Then, late one night, the detective received a call that shifted everything sideways. A storage unit. Rented under Ellison's old name. Forgotten. Delinquent. Its contents scheduled for auction. Inside, among boxes of tools and yellowed paperwork, investigators found items that didn't belong to a repairman's discarded life. A woman's scarf. Old. Faded. A brand Laura had owned, according to photographs. A notebook with dates and addresses, including Alder Street, circled heavily. Overwritten again and again. And at the bottom of one box, wrapped carefully in plastic, a kitchen knife. The knife showed no visible blood. No obvious trace after all these years. But it wasn't the object itself that sent a chill through the room. It was the care. The preservation. The way it had been kept, not thrown away, not forgotten, but saved. Saved like a memory. The evidence was rushed to the lab. Time stretched thin. Every hour an exercise in restraint. If this didn't yield something concrete, the case might collapse under the weight of its own anticipation. Prosecutors waited. Families waited. The detective waited, replaying interviews, imagining alternative explanations, preparing himself for disappointment. When the call finally came, it wasn't triumphant. It was careful. Measured. The knife had yielded trace DNA. Degraded. Fragmentary. But consistent. Consistent with the partial profile from the hair. Consistent with the familial match. Consistent with Mark Ellison. Still, consistency wasn't certainty.
Not yet.
The detective stood alone in the evidence room, staring at the items laid out under harsh white light, feeling the strange duality of cold cases nearing resolution. The closer you get, the heavier it becomes. The truth doesn't rush forward. It resists. It hides behind technicalities and legal thresholds, daring you to prove what you already know. Somewhere between 1995 and now, Laura Whitman had slipped through a crack in the world. And standing there, surrounded by fragments of her last night, the detective understood that the case wasn't just about solving a crime anymore. It was about forcing the past to answer for the silence it had kept for far too long. By the time the case reached the district attorney's desk, the word cold no longer fit, but neither did solved, And that limbo was the most dangerous place for an investigation to live, because suspicion without certainty invites doubt, and doubt is where defense attorneys thrive, sharpening every inconsistency into a blade meant to cut years of work down to nothing. The evidence against Mark Ellison had shape now, texture, gravity, but it still lacked the one thing time is ruthless about stealing, a moment that could not be explained away. Prosecutors moved slowly, deliberately, asking questions that felt less like curiosity and more like resistance. Could the DNA be secondary transfer? Could the knife have been planted? Could the scarf have been acquired innocently? Could coincidence stretch thin enough, still hold? The detective answered each challenge patiently, knowing impatience would be mistaken for weakness. He didn't argue what he felt. He argued what he could prove. They needed more. Something that anchored Ellison to that night in a way no explanation could loosen. Something human. Something that remembered even if people didn't. The detective turned back to Laura's final hours, to the sliver of time between the convenience store receipt and the silence that followed. He revisited the store, now renovated, bright, indifferent to its own history. In the 90s, surveillance cameras had been grainy, often overwritten, but policies varied, and sometimes forgotten backups survived in forgotten places. He tracked down the former owner, then a retired manager, then an old technician who had once serviced the store's equipment. It took weeks, then months, and then, buried in a storage shed behind a suburban home, they found tapes. The footage was degraded, warped by heat and time, but it was there. Laura at the counter. The milk. The bread. Her posture relaxed, unguarded. And then, in the background, a man near the door. Out of focus. Waiting.
Not buying anything.
Just watching. When the image was enhanced, frame by frame, the outline sharpened enough to suggest a familiar shape. The height. The build. The way he stood, weight shifted slightly to one side. Mark Ellison. It wasn't definitive. Nothing ever was. But it placed him near her shortly before she vanished, and it contradicted his long-standing claim that he hadn't seen Laura that night. The detective felt the ground firm slightly beneath his feet. This wasn't proof of murder, but it was proof of presence. And presence mattered. Ellison was brought in again, this time with less pretense. The detective played the footage without commentary, letting the images speak in their own broken, flickering language. Ellison leaned forward, squinting, dismissive at first, then quieter. He said it could be anyone. The detective didn't argue. He simply asked why Ellison hadn't mentioned being at the store when he'd been asked repeatedly about his movements that night. Ellison's answer came slower this time. He said he'd forgotten. Said it was decades ago. Said memory fades. The detective nodded. Memory does fade. But patterns don't. Lies, when repeated often enough, carve grooves deep enough to follow straight back to their origin. The pressure mounted outside the interview room. Laura's family, long resigned to not knowing, began receiving calls again. Old wounds reopened. Hope returned cautiously, like an animal approaching a trap it remembered too well. The media caught wind of the renewed investigation, headlines echoing words they had used decades earlier, now sharpened by the promise of resolution. California 1995 cold case. Warms up. Neighbor under renewed scrutiny. Ellison noticed the attention. His routines shifted again. He stopped going out. Stopped answering calls. Then came the mistake. It was small. Almost invisible. A trash bag placed at the curb a day early. Inside, among mundane refuse, investigators found torn paper, reconstructed later into fragments of notes.
Dates. Times.
A name written once, then scratched out so hard the paper nearly tore. Laura. The handwriting matched Ellison's notebook from the storage unit. Another coincidence, perhaps. Another thread added to a tapestry that was becoming harder to deny. The detective felt the case tightening, like a noose slowly, patiently drawn. But Ellison remained free. Calm on the surface.
Silent beneath.
And silence, after so many years, can feel like victory to someone who believes time has already done the hardest part for them. The break didn't come from science or surveillance. It came from someone who had been standing just outside the frame all along. Ellison's ex-wife. They had been married briefly in the late 90s, a relationship that began a few years after Laura vanished and ended quietly, unremarkably, like so many others. When investigators contacted her, she was hesitant, guarded, clearly unsure whether reopening the past would cost her more than it gave. But something in the renewed headlines had unsettled her. Something she had tried for years to rationalize away. She spoke slowly, carefully, choosing words that wouldn't betray her own uncertainty. Ellison, she said, had never talked about Laura directly, but he had talked about neighbors, about boundaries, about women who led men on without realizing it, about mistakes that couldn't be undone. At the time, she dismissed it as bitterness. Now, it sounded different. Then she mentioned the night terrors. Ellison would wake up sweating, disoriented, muttering fragments that never formed full sentences. A house. A fence. A woman who wouldn't stop talking.
A knife.
He never said a name, never described a crime, just enough to leave impressions that lingered long after morning came. She had urged him to see someone. He had refused, said the past was better left alone. Her statement wasn't evidence in the strict sense.
But it was context.
It was corroboration of a psyche that had never fully escaped whatever happened in 1995. Prosecutors listened carefully, weighing its value, understanding that juries respond not just to facts, but to stories that make facts make sense. Ellison was arrested quietly, without spectacle, early one morning when the street was still empty. No resistance, no outburst, just a nod as the cuffs closed, as if he had known this moment would arrive eventually. The charge was a murder.
Not yet.
It was obstruction, lying to investigators, a legal foothold in a case that still demanded more. In custody, Ellison requested a lawyer immediately. The flow of information slowed to a trickle. The case entered a new phase, colder in some ways than before, because now everything mattered more. Every word, every omission. The stakes had shifted from curiosity to consequence. The detective reviewed the evidence again, this time not as an investigator chasing truth, but as an advocate preparing for battle. He saw the weaknesses clearly, the gaps, the places where time had won. And he saw the strength, too, in accumulation, in consistency, in the quiet refusal of the facts to let Ellison drift back into anonymity. Laura Whitman still had no body. No confirmed cause of death. The absence that defined the case from the beginning remained its greatest obstacle. But absence can speak, if you listen long enough. It speaks through what was taken and never returned. Through routines interrupted forever. Through a house that waited for someone who never came home. As the case moved forward, inching toward a courtroom that might finally demand answers, the detective understood that even now, nothing was guaranteed. Cold cases don't resolve cleanly. They resist closure. They punish certainty. But for the first time in nearly 30 years, the silence surrounding Laura's disappearance felt strained, as if it were running out of places to hide. The courtroom wasn't where the truth lived yet, but it was where it would be tested, stretched, questioned until only what could survive pressure remained. And as Mark Ellison sat behind the defense table, hands folded, expression carefully neutral, the years between 1995 and now compressed into a single, suffocating present, one where every glance, every breath, every pause carried the weight of a woman who never came home. The charge was still obstruction, a procedural doorway into something larger, something unspoken but heavy in the room. Prosecutors knew better than to rush. A premature murder charge without a body could shatter everything. Instead, they watched. They listened. They waited for Ellison to make the mistake that time had trained him to believe he no longer could. The detective took the stand first, not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a chronicler of absence. He spoke plainly.
Dates. Times.
Evidence. He laid out the case like a slow burn rather than an explosion, letting the accumulation do the work. The defense objected frequently, their strategy clear from the start. Doubt everything, frame the investigation as a resurrection of old ghosts driven by modern obsession rather than fact. They attacked the DNA. partial, degraded, inconclusive on its own. They attacked the knife. No blood. No victim. No proof it was ever used in a crime. They attacked the storage unit. Forgotten. Accessible. Vulnerable to contamination. They attacked memory itself, reminding the jury that decades distort perception, that what feels true now might be nothing more than a story shaped by hindsight. Ellison watched it all with the patience of someone who had waited a long time for this moment. His lawyer spoke of coincidence as if it were a misunderstood ally, of proximity as an accident of geography, of a quiet man transformed into a monster by narrative momentum. And for stretches of time, it worked. Jurors leaned back. Pens stopped moving. Doubt did what doubt always does best. Then came the audio. The detective had saved it for this moment, knowing it wasn't explosive on its own, knowing its power lay in context. A recording from Ellison's second interview, cleaned up, isolated, played slowly through courtroom speakers. The question about the payphone. The pause. Half the second. Maybe less. But audible. Tangible. A break in rhythm that everyone could hear once it was pointed out. The prosecutor didn't dramatize it. She simply asked the jury to listen again. And again. She spoke about patterns. About how truth flows differently than lies. About how the body hesitates when the mind scrambles to maintain a fiction built long ago. The defense objected. The judge overruled. The jury listened. Ellison's jaw tightened. The prosecution called the lab analyst next.
Calm.
Methodical. He explained how degraded DNA still carries a signature, how probability narrows when multiple independent samples begin to align, how coincidence becomes statistically unreasonable when enough variables overlap. He never said certainty. He didn't need to. The math spoke quietly, relentlessly. Then Laura's sister took the stand. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied, anchored by years of forced composure. She talked about the phone call at 9:10 p.m., about the way Laura laughed that night, tired but content, about how she never missed work without calling, never vanished without explanation. She didn't accuse Ellison.
She didn't need to.
She described a life interrupted so completely that the interruption itself became evidence. The defense cross-examined gently, careful not to appear cruel. They asked about Laura's independence, her privacy, the possibility that she had chosen to leave. The sister shook her head, not angrily, not dramatically, just firmly. Laura wouldn't have disappeared, she said.
Not like that.
Not without a word. Not without her shoes. The shoes came up again. The neat placement by the door. The universal, mundane ritual that suddenly felt enormous. The prosecutor lingered on it, letting jurors imagine themselves stepping out of their own shoes, trusting the space they were in, trusting the person they were with. Trust, she suggested, was the unseen accomplice in this case. Ellison's ex-wife testified next. The courtroom shifted when she spoke. Not because her words were explosive, but because they were intimate. Night terrors. Fragments.
A knife.
A fence. She was careful, almost apologetic, as if afraid of accusing the man she had once loved. The defense tried to undermine her credibility, suggesting resentment, exaggeration, misremembered dreams.
She didn't argue.
She simply said she had tried very hard, for many years, not to see what now seemed impossible to unsee. Ellison stared straight ahead. The judge recessed for the day with no ruling beyond scheduling. Outside, reporters clustered, headlines already half-written. Cold case edges toward resolution. Neighbor on trial decades later. The community felt the pull of something unfinished finally demanding attention.
Some believed.
Some doubted. Most waited, afraid to lean too hard in either direction. In custody, Ellison grew quieter. The detective noticed the change during routine check-ins. The man who had once explained himself freely now spoke only when necessary, conserving words like a resource running low. But silence under sustained pressure has a way of turning inward. It happened late one night, in a holding cell lit too brightly for sleep. Ellison asked to speak to someone. Not his lawyer. Not the detective. A chaplain. The request was noted.
Aloud.
Confidential. But not invisible. The next morning, Ellison asked again, this time for the detective. They sat across from each other in a small room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. No recorder this time. No formal interview. Just two men, and the years between them. Ellison's hands shook slightly. He blamed the cold. The detective said nothing. Ellison spoke in fragments. About regret. About mistakes. About things that start small and end bigger than anyone expects. He never said Laura's name. He never said what happened that night. But he said something else instead, something that lodged itself deep and refused to let go. He said the fence was lower back then. The detective looked up slowly. Ellison realized what he had done the moment the words left his mouth. He closed his eyes, just briefly, like someone bracing for impact. The detective didn't press. He didn't need to. No record. No signature. But it was the first time Ellison had acknowledged a detail he could only know by being there, by crossing that 20-foot gap not as a neighbor, but as a participant. When the detective left the room, he felt no triumph. Only gravity. The kind that settles when a case tilts, not into certainty, but into inevitability. The absence that had defined Laura Whitman's disappearance for decades was beginning to take on shape, and shape, once formed, is hard to deny. Outside, the sun rose over Alder Street, casting light across lawns that had long since grown back, as if nothing had ever happened there at all. The words about the fence didn't echo loudly. They didn't need to. They settled instead, sinking into the case like a weight dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that touched everything, because details like that don't come from imagination. They come from memory, from standing in a place at a specific time, from crossing a boundary that was never meant to be crossed, and once spoken. They can't be pulled back, only reinterpreted, recontextualized, re-examined until they point somewhere undeniable. The prosecutor moved quickly but quietly. No press releases. No leaks. Just motions filed. Argument sharpened, strategy adjusted. The fence comment wasn't a confession, but it was a crack, and cracks invite leverage. Investigators returned to Alder Street with survey records, old photographs, city permits. They confirmed what Ellison had accidentally revealed. In the late 90s, several homeowners had raised their fences after a string of petty thefts. In 1995, the barrier between Laura's yard and Ellison's had been lower. Easier to step over. Easier to lean across. Easier to cross without leaving much trace. The detective stood there again, imagining Ellison's path not as a theory now, but as a practiced movement. Over the fence, across the grass, to the back door that was never forced. The picture felt complete in a way it hadn't before, not because every piece was perfect, but because nothing felt out of place anymore. In court, the defense tried to contain the damage. They framed the fence comment as confusion, as the byproduct of years spent living in similar houses, similar neighborhoods, similar routines. They suggested Ellison had simply absorbed details over time, from news coverage, from gossip, from his own imagination filling gaps left by repetition. It was a clever argument. It always is. But it required the jury to believe that a man who claimed to remember nothing about that night could somehow recall the exact height of a fence decades earlier. The prosecution didn't push too hard. They let the contradiction sit, trusting the jury to feel its imbalance. Then came the forensic timeline. Using updated software, analysts reconstructed the likely sequence of events based on what little physical evidence remained. The pressed grass, the scuff on the hallway wall, the absence of disturbance. They didn't claim certainty. They didn't need to. They presented probability. A narrow window. A controlled interaction that turned suddenly irreversible. A removal that didn't involve panic but planning. Laura's body had never been found, but absence leaves its own marks. Her bank accounts went untouched. Her social security number never surfaced. Her medical license lapsed. Her life didn't scatter. It stopped. The prosecutor spoke about that stillness, about how voluntary disappearances ripple outward with traces of intention, while involuntary ones collapse inward, leaving nothing but silence. Ellison watched without expression. The jury was taken to see Alder Street, a rare move but one the judge allowed. Standing there, listening to explanations through headphones, jurors measured distances with their eyes, felt the closeness, the intimacy of a crime that didn't need a dark alley or a remote field, just a neighbor's familiarity and a moment of access. The houses felt too close. The fences too symbolic. The space too small to hold a mystery for so long without someone knowing more than they ever admitted. Back in court, the storage unit evidence returned, this time framed not as a collection of objects, but as a timeline of retention. Why keep a scarf for decades? Why wrap a knife? Why circle an address again and again? The defense suggested sentimentality, nostalgia, coincidence. The prosecution suggested something else. Trophies. Memory anchors. Reminders of control. The word hung in the air, uncomfortable but effective. Ellison's lawyer requested a break. When proceedings resumed, something had shifted. The confidence that once insulated Ellison had thinned, worn down by repetition and exposure. He no longer looked like a man wrongly accused. He looked like a man calculating outcomes, measuring losses. Then the judge made a ruling that changed the temperature of the room. Based on the accumulation of evidence, the obstruction charge was expanded. Ellison would now face charges related to unlawful restraint and suspected homicide, pending further findings. It wasn't a conviction. It wasn't closure. But it was the first time the legal system had formally acknowledged what everyone in the room already felt pressing in from the edges. The media reaction was immediate. Headlines flared. Cold case edges toward breakthrough. DNA and decades converge. The town felt the pull of vindication and dread in equal measure. Some residents dug up old memories. Others resisted, uncomfortable with the idea that safety had been an illusion all along. In custody, Ellison deteriorated. Not dramatically. Subtly. He stopped eating regularly. Stopped sleeping. He asked fewer questions and gave shorter answers. The detective noticed bruises on his knuckles from gripping metal bars too tightly. Stress has a way of finding expression when words fail. Then, without warning, Ellison asked for a deal. The request didn't come with conditions at first. Just a statement passed through his attorney. He was willing to talk, to clarify, to help bring closure. The phrasing was careful, non-committal, but the meaning was clear. The wall was cracking. The prosecutor agreed to listen, nothing more. No promises. No immunity. Just a room, or a quarter, and the truth if Ellison was finally ready to offer it. They met in the same interview room where so many half-answers had been spoken. This time, Ellison looked smaller. Older. The years had caught up to him all at once. He stared at the table, tracing imaginary lines with his finger. He started by talking about Laura as a person, not a victim. Said she was kind. Said she listened. Said she made him feel seen in a way he hadn't expected. The detective let him talk, knowing that confession rarely begins with the crime itself. It begins with justification. Ellison said he hadn't planned anything. Said it was a conversation that went wrong. Said words escalated. Said fear took over. He avoided specifics, circling the event like someone afraid to look directly at the center of a fire. When pressed, he stopped, closed his eyes, and whispered that some moments don't belong to daylight. The recorder kept running. Outside the room, the prosecutor listened through the glass, measuring every pause, every deflection. This wasn't a confession yet, but it was closer than they had ever been. Ellison finally looked up, eyes glassy, voice barely audible, and said there was a place, somewhere outside town, where the ground was soft back then. The room went silent. The detective felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the signal that a case was crossing a threshold. He didn't ask where. Not yet. He didn't ask how. Not yet. He let the silence stretch, knowing that after decades of running from it, the truth was finally learning how to stand on its own. Silence has a texture when it stretches long enough, and in that interview room it felt dense, almost physical, pressing against the walls as Ellison's last words hung there unfinished. A place outside town, soft ground, a sentence shaped like an open door that no one rushed through because rushing was how lies slipped away, and the detective understood that after decades of evasion, the truth was finally learning to breathe, but it would suffocate if handled too roughly. Ellison broke the silence himself. He always did, eventually. He spoke about driving at night, about roads that feel longer when you don't want to arrive anywhere, about headlights cutting narrow tunnels through darkness. He said he remembered the smell first, damp earth, eucalyptus, something metallic he didn't want to name. He said the place wasn't special. That was why he chose it. No landmarks. No reason to return. Just emptiness that promised to stay empty. The prosecutor asked him to be specific. Ellison hesitated, then shook his head. Not yet. He said he needed assurances. Not freedom. Not forgiveness. Just that whatever he said would end the waiting. The detective watched him carefully. People who confess don't always want absolution. Sometimes they just want the noise to stop. Negotiations followed, slow and cautious. No immunity. No guarantees beyond consideration. Enough to keep him talking, not enough to let him control the narrative. Ellison agreed, finally, to guide investigators to the area. Not to a spot. Not to a grave. Just to the place he remembered. They drove before dawn, a small convoy moving quietly out of the city, away from the streets that had held Laura's absence for so long. Ellison sat in the back, cuffed, staring out the window as familiar lights gave way to darkness and then to open land. He corrected directions occasionally. Turn here.
Slow down.
Not that road. His voice grew steadier the farther they went, as if distance itself was easing the pressure he'd carried. The area he led them to was undeveloped land on the edge of what had once been farmland, now partially reclaimed by weeds and scrub. In the 90s, it had been accessible by dirt paths. Now it was bordered by fencing and signs warning against trespassing. Ellison asked them to stop. He stepped out slowly, scanning the ground with an expression that wasn't fear so much as recognition. He pointed toward a shallow depression barely visible beneath years of growth. Forensic teams moved in carefully, methodically, aware of how fragile hope becomes after so much time. Soil samples were taken. Ground-penetrating radar rolled across the area, its screen flickering with ambiguous shapes that could mean everything or nothing. Ellison watched from a distance, shoulders slumped, as if the land itself were replaying something he had tried to forget. They didn't find a body that day. What they found instead were traces. Fabric fibers consistent with Laura's clothing. Microscopic fragments of bone, too small to reconstruct, too degraded to identify conclusively without extensive testing. Enough to suggest that something had once been there. Enough to confirm Ellison hadn't invented the place. Enough to push the case across another invisible line. Back at the station, Ellison's demeanor shifted again. The relief he might have expected didn't come. Instead, he seemed more burdened, as if speaking had reattached him to a past he had spent decades trying to outrun. He asked for water. Asked for a moment. Then, unprompted, he began to talk. He said Laura had trusted him. Said she hadn't screamed. Said that mattered to him, though he couldn't explain why. He described an argument that spiraled, words spoken that couldn't be taken back, a shove that became something else when fear took over. He said he hadn't meant to kill her. Said that sentence like a mantra, repeating it until it lost meaning. The detective listened, face still, hands folded, letting the confession assemble itself piece by piece. Confessions rarely arrive fully formed. They come in fragments, shaped by self-preservation, by guilt, by the need to appear less monstrous than the act itself. The truth, when it finally surfaces, often looks smaller than expected, but heavier. Ellison described moving her body with a calm that unsettled everyone in the room. Not frantic, not panicked, methodical. He said he'd practiced repair work his whole life, fixing broken things, solving problems step by step. That night, he said, he treated the situation the same way. Identify the issue. Eliminate the complication. Clean up. When he finished, the room felt hollowed out. The prosecutor stopped the recording and sat back, eyes closed briefly, absorbing the finality of what had just been said. The detective felt no satisfaction, only a deep, quiet exhaustion. Laura Whitman had been gone for nearly 30 years, and in less than an hour, the shape of her final moments had emerged, imperfect, self-serving, but real enough to end the guessing. Charges were amended again. Murder, evidence tampering, unlawful disposal of human remains. The legal language was precise, clinical, a poor match for the human weight behind it. Ellison signed the statements without protest. He didn't ask for mercy. He didn't ask for understanding. He looked relieved, in a way that felt almost obscene. The community reacted in waves. Shock gave way to anger. Anger to a strange, bitter relief. The idea that the killer had lived next door all along rewrote the past for everyone who had ever walked Alder Street without suspicion. People revisited old memories, reinterpreting smiles, small favors, ordinary moments now tainted by proximity to something unspeakable. Laura's family received the news quietly. No celebration, no sense of victory, just the end of a question that had shaped their lives for decades. Her sister visited the site outside town, stood at the edge of the cordoned-off land, and cried not because Laura was found, but because she never would be, not fully, not in a way that returned what was taken. As the case moved toward trial, the cold case label began to peel away in headlines and conversations, replaced by words like confession and closure, but the detective knew better. Some cases don't close. They settle. They become part of the ground they disturb. On Alder Street, the houses stood as they always had, quiet, orderly, indifferent. Children played. Lawns were watered. The fence between 2 yards had long since been raised, taller now, more imposing, a barrier built too late to matter. And somewhere beneath the soil outside town, traces of a woman's life remained, scattered, incomplete, refusing to be fully erased, even by time. The truth had finally spoken, but it had done so in a voice shaped by years of silence, leaving behind not peace, but a deeper understanding of how easily evil can blend into the ordinary, how close it can live, how long it can wait. Confession doesn't end a case. It just changes the shape of the waiting. And after Ellison's words were sealed into transcripts and evidence bags were relabeled with heavier charges, the machinery of justice moved forward with deliberate slowness, grinding, methodical, indifferent to emotion, because courts don't respond to catharsis, they respond to proof, and even a confession, especially one born decades late, must survive scrutiny. Defense attorneys shifted strategy overnight. The narrative hardened. Coercion. Psychological pressure. A vulnerable man broken by time and isolation led into saying what investigators wanted to hear. They questioned the conditions of the interviews, the length, the subtle leverage of hope implied but never promised. They argued that memory after 30 years is not recollection, it's reconstruction, shaped by suggestion and fear. Ellison sat through it all, quieter now, thinner somehow, as if each word spoken in his own defense peeled something away rather than adding protection. When asked why he confessed if it wasn't true, the defense suggested desperation, exhaustion, a desire to escape the endless limbo of suspicion. Ellison didn't argue. He let others speak for him, a man finally surrendering control after decades of guarding it. The prosecution countered with detail. Specifics Ellison had volunteered before investigators ever asked. The route, the texture of the soil, the way Laura's house sounded at night. Details that matched the physical record too closely to dismiss. They played portions of the confession again, not for drama, but for precision, pausing to align Ellison's words with photographs, maps, forensic findings. The jury listened differently now, less curious, more burdened. This wasn't a mystery unfolding anymore. It was a reckoning. Experts testified about delayed confessions, about the psychology of offenders who live close to their crimes, about the way proximity can intensify both control and guilt. They spoke of offenders who insert themselves into investigations, who offer help, who remain nearby not out of bravado, but because familiarity dulls suspicion. The phrase hiding in plain sight surfaced more than once, each time landing heavier. Ellison's behavior in 1995 was revisited through this lens. The water bottles, the cooperative interviews, the calm. At the time, it had read as innocence. Now it looked like camouflage. The defense returned again and again to the absence of a body. They spoke of reasonable doubt as a living thing, something that thrives in gaps and unanswered questions. They asked the jury to consider whether fragments and fibers could truly replace the certainty of remains, whether a confession without physical recovery could ever be enough. The prosecutor responded without raising her voice. She spoke about absence as evidence, about how some crimes are designed to leave nothing behind, not by accident, but by intent. She reminded the jury that the law does not require a body, only truth beyond reasonable doubt, and that reasonable doubt cannot be manufactured by the very success of a crime. Ellison was offered the chance to speak. He stood slowly, hands clasped, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the jury, beyond the room, beyond the moment. His voice was steady, almost gentle. He said he knew words couldn't undo anything. Said he hadn't confessed for sympathy. Said he was tired of lying to himself. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't explain why he waited so long. He simply said Laura deserved to be acknowledged, not erased. It was the first time he said her name aloud in court. The room went still. Deliberations stretched on, hours bleeding into days. Outside, cameras waited. Inside, jurors revisited evidence, arguments, doubt itself. Cold cases don't deliver clean consensus easily. They ask people to bridge time with belief, to trust that fragments can form a whole. When the verdict came, it wasn't dramatic. No gasps, no shouts. Just a quiet reading of words that carried irreversible weight.
Guilty.
Ellison closed his eyes. Laura's sister exhaled a breath she'd been holding for nearly 3 decades. The detective felt the strange, hollow relief that comes not with victory, but with an ending that has cost too much to celebrate. Sentencing followed weeks later.
Life.
The word echoed in the courtroom, heavy with irony. Ellison listened without visible reaction. When asked if he had anything to say, he shook his head. He had used up his words. Outside, Alder Street was mentioned again in headlines, in retrospectives, in true crime segments that tried to compress decades into minutes. Viewers shook their heads, marveled at the proximity, the normalcy, the idea that a killer could live next door. The story became a cautionary tale, stripped of its quiet details, simplified for consumption. But those who had lived it knew better. They knew about the waiting, about the years where nothing moved and everything hurt, about the way hope thins until it becomes dangerous to touch. They knew that closure doesn't arrive as a clean break, but as a gradual settling, like dust after a collapse. Laura Whitman's name was entered into records as resolved, her case reclassified, her file closed. But the absence she left didn't close with it. It remained in the small things. In a porch light remembered. In shoes by a door. In a fence raised too late. The detective returned once more to the land outside town, now quiet again, marked only by disturbed soil slowly reclaiming its shape. He stood there without taking notes, without imagining alternatives, without chasing what-ifs. Some truths, once faced, ask only to be witnessed. The cold case was over. What remained was the understanding that time doesn't solve crimes on its own. It only hides them, waiting for someone patient enough, stubborn enough, to listen to what silence has been carrying all along. After the verdict, the noise faded faster than anyone expected, the cameras packing up, the headlines moving on, leaving behind a quieter aftermath where the real weight of the case finally settled, because resolution doesn't arrive with applause, it arrives in empty rooms, in routines forced to adjust to the absence of waiting, and for those closest to the case. The end felt less like a conclusion and more like a long exhale after years of holding breath without realizing it. Laura Whitman's family returned to lives that had been paused in subtle ways for decades. Her sister found herself reaching for the phone less often, no longer expecting a call that would never come, and that realization hurt in a new way, because hope, even painful hope, gives structure to grief, and when it disappears, grief has to learn a different shape. She sorted through boxes of Laura's belongings that had been kept untouched, letters, photographs, small objects infused with ordinary meaning, now heavy with finality. There was talk of a memorial, not a funeral, something that acknowledged a life rather than an ending. No remains to bury, no marker to visit, just a name and a span of years that felt incomplete. Friends from the hospital attended, older now, grayer, speaking in hushed tones about night shifts and coffee breaks, about how Laura used to hum when she charted notes, about a kindness that seemed small then and enormous now. The detective stepped back from the case officially, reassigned, redirected, but mentally he lingered, replaying moments that no longer demanded answers, but still asked questions. He thought about Ellison's calm over the years, about how easily suspicion had slid past him, and about how many other cases sat in boxes, waiting for the right convergence of patience and progress. Cold cases, he knew now more than ever, weren't just unsolved crimes. They were stories frozen mid-sentence. Ellison began his life sentence in a facility far from Alder Street, far from the neighborhoods that had once sheltered him, without knowing what they were sheltering. Inside, he blended again. Another quiet man among many, his notoriety fading quickly in a place where everyone carried a story they didn't tell. He wrote a letter once, addressed to no one in particular, expressing remorse in vague terms, never sent, folded and unfolded until the paper softened. Some confessions aren't meant for delivery. The legal record was finalized, transcripts archived, exhibits returned to storage or destroyed according to protocol. The knife was sealed and logged one last time before disappearing into evidence management, an object stripped of narrative, reduced to inventory. The scarf was returned to Laura's family. They debated what to do with it, whether keeping it honored her or anchored them too tightly to the worst moment of her life. In the end, they placed it in a box with her photographs, not hidden, not displayed, simply acknowledged. Alder Street adjusted slowly. Neighbors spoke more openly now, conversations drifting toward what they hadn't said before, what they hadn't noticed, what they wished they'd questioned. Some felt guilt. Others felt anger at the idea that responsibility could be retroactive. The houses didn't change. The sidewalks didn't remember. But the people did. Proximity took on a new meaning. Familiarity lost some of its comfort. True crime producers reached out, eager to retell the story, to package it into episodes and arcs, to frame it as a triumph of persistence and science. The detective declined most requests. He understood the appetite, but he also understood how easily nuance is flattened when a story becomes content. This case wasn't about clever twists or shocking reveals. It was about time, about patience, about how ordinary spaces can hold extraordinary secrets. At the edge of town, the land where fragments had been found was fenced off briefly, then released back into anonymity. No marker, no sign, just soil slowly settling, plants reclaiming disturbed ground. Nature, indifferent and thorough, did what it always does, smoothing over evidence of human chaos without erasing its consequence. Years later, new detectives would read the file as a success story, a reminder that persistence matters. They would note the advances in DNA, the importance of revisiting assumptions, the danger of overlooking the familiar. They would study it academically, professionally, but they wouldn't feel the waiting. They wouldn't feel the silence stretching across decades. That weight can't be taught. It has to be carried. Laura Whitman's story became part of departmental lore, not as a legend, but as a warning. Look twice at what feels safe. Question what feels normal. Remember that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it borrows the language of routine and lives quietly until someone finally listens closely enough to hear the dissonance. On certain nights, when the detective drove home late, he found himself noticing porch lights, fences, side yards, the small spaces between houses that never seem important until they are. He didn't imagine crimes unfolding. He imagined choices, moments where paths diverge quietly, where trust is extended without ceremony, where ordinary life offers access without suspicion. The case had ended, but its residue remained, not as fear, but as awareness. Awareness that cold cases don't stay cold because they lack answers, but because those answers are buried under years of assumptions, overlooked details, and the human desire to believe that danger is always distant, always obvious, always someone else's problem. Laura Whitman had lived next door to her killer. And for a long time, that was the hardest truth of all. Time moved forward the way it always does, indifferent to conclusions, carrying the solved case with it like sediment at the bottom of a river, no longer visible on the surface, but shaping the current all the same, because even after the gavel fell and the files were closed, the case refused to fully release its grip on the people it had touched, lingering in the quiet spaces where memory tends to speak the loudest. For the Whitman family, the world felt subtly altered. Not dramatically broken, not healed either, just different in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't lived inside the waiting. Birthdays arrived without the familiar ache of uncertainty, replaced by something heavier, the certainty that nothing new would ever be learned, that every question with meaning had already been answered, and that the answers themselves could not restore what had been taken. They learned that closure is not an event. It's a slow, uneven process, full of setbacks, moments of calm followed by sudden surges of grief that arrive without warning. Laura's name appeared occasionally in academic papers, in seminars about forensic genealogy, cited as an example of how technology reshaped the limits of justice. Her story was reduced to bullet points and timelines, stripped of its human texture, and while the family understood the importance, they couldn't help but feel the loss of her voice all over again, because in those retellings, Laura was evidence before she was a person. In the neighborhood, Alder Street remained deceptively normal. Children rode bicycles past the house where Ellison once lived. New residents moved in, unaware of the history embedded in the walls, learning the rhythms of trash pickup and school schedules without realizing they were stepping into a place that had once held a secret for decades. Those who had lived there back in 1995 noticed the contrast most sharply, how easily a place can absorb tragedy and keep functioning, how quickly horror becomes background noise when enough time passes. The detective, now closer to retirement than he liked to admit, carried the case with him in subtler ways. It had changed how he read silence, how he interpreted cooperation, how he viewed the concept of normalcy in investigations. He trusted less in instincts shaped by familiarity and more in process, in data, in the uncomfortable necessity of questioning what felt obvious. The Laura Whitman case had taught him that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones that feel kind. He remembered the early days of the investigation, the press conferences filled with cautious optimism, the belief that proximity equaled safety, that neighbors were buffers against harm rather than potential sources of it. Back then, the idea that the killer lived next door had seemed almost offensive, an insult to the social contract everyone silently agreed to. Now, that belief felt naive, a relic of a time when danger was imagined as something external, something that arrived loudly, wearing a recognizable face. Ellison's existence faded into the background noise of the prison system. No interviews, no elaborate confessions, no attempts at notoriety. He followed routines, attended mandated programs, spoke little. Guards described him as unremarkable, which somehow felt fitting. The banality of his days mirrored the banality of his deception, the way he had hidden in plain sight for years without arousing suspicion. Evil, in this case, had not been theatrical. It had been patient. Occasionally, letters arrived at the department, handwritten notes from strangers who believed the case had sparked memories, half-formed suspicions about people in their own lives. Most led nowhere. Some revealed more about fear than fact. The detective read them anyway, understanding that cases like this don't just resolve crimes, they awaken doubts, forcing people to re-examine the past with a sharper, more suspicious lens. True crime podcasts continued to reference the case, often inaccurately, smoothing over inconvenient complexities in favor of narrative symmetry. Listeners debated motives, speculated about psychological triggers, searched for meaning that might explain how someone could live for decades with a secret like that. The truth was less satisfying. There was no grand revelation, No single moment that unlocked Ellison's behavior. Just opportunity, proximity, and a choice made once and protected by silence ever since. The advances in forensic science that cracked the case moved forward relentlessly, solving others, reshaping the landscape of criminal justice. Old files were reopened across the country, names resurfaced, families contacted after years of silence. Some cases ended in relief. Others ended in disappointment. Not every cold case was waiting for a miracle. Laura's had been. And that distinction weighed heavily on those who understood how rare it truly was. On quiet evenings, Laura's sister would sometimes replay the last voicemail she'd saved, not because it offered answers, but because it offered continuity, a voice unchanged by what came after. She noticed details she hadn't before, the slight rush in Laura's speech, the casual mention of dinner plans that never happened. Those small, ordinary fragments felt precious now, proof that Laura had existed fully before becoming a case number. The city itself absorbed the story the way cities always do, folding it into a larger narrative of crime and consequence, using it to justify policy changes, funding requests, training programs. There were seminars, workshops, panels discussing the lessons learned. Yet no policy could address the most unsettling aspect of the case. That trust, once broken at such close range, leaves a permanent fracture in how communities perceive themselves. People began locking doors earlier. Neighborhood watch groups gained members. Conversations about safety grew sharper, less abstract. But fear was not the dominant legacy. Awareness was. A recognition that familiarity is not proof of innocence, that danger does not need to look like danger to be real. Years after the conviction, a journalist asked the detective if the case still haunted him. He paused before answering, considering the word. Haunted suggested something unresolved, something unfinished. This case was finished. What remained was something else entirely. A permanent adjustment to how he saw the world. It wasn't the violence that lingered. It was the proximity. The knowledge that for years, Laura Whitman's killer had lived close enough to hear her door open, close enough to observe her routines, close enough to understand her trust, and that none of it had triggered alarm bells until it was far too late. That realization didn't fade with time. It settled in, and it changed everything. There is a moment, long after the noise has died down, when a solved case begins to feel unsolved again, not in the legal sense, not on paper, but in the human one, because answers do not erase the path that led to the questions, and time does not rewind simply because truth finally caught up with the lie. It only keeps moving, carrying the weight forward. On Alder Street, the nights were quiet in the way they had always been quiet, porch lights humming, windows glowing softly, the familiar soundtrack of televisions and distant traffic filling the air, and yet the silence felt altered, charged with a knowledge that could not be unlearned, the understanding that for years the street had breathed normally while something fundamentally wrong lived inside it, undetected, unchallenged, unimagined. People who had never met Laura Whitman spoke her name now with a strange intimacy, as if proximity to the story created a connection, as if knowing what happened gave them a claim to her memory, and in some ways it did, because unresolved violence ripples outward, touching lives far beyond its origin, leaving behind a low-frequency hum of unease that persists long after the source is identified. Laura herself remained frozen in time, 32 years old forever, preserved in photographs where her smile hadn't yet learned how to be cautious, where the future still existed as a wide, open thing. Those who loved her aged past her, crossed milestones she never would, and learned that grief is not a single emotion but a shifting landscape, one that changes shape as years pass, as certainty replaces doubt, as imagination gives way to fact. The detective finally retired, his badge placed in a drawer, his days no longer structured by calls and reports, but the habits lingered. He still noticed details others ignored, still measured silences, still felt a reflexive tightening when someone described a person as harmless simply because they were familiar. The case had carved something permanent into his perception, a quiet skepticism that would never fully fade. Sometimes he thought about the first night after Laura disappeared, the urgency, The belief that speed would save the day, that the truth was close, just out of reach. He thought about how wrong they'd been, how the truth had been standing still all along, waiting for time and technology to align in its favor. Justice, he learned, does not always arrive quickly, but when it does, it arrives without apology for the delay. Ellison would spend the rest of his life within concrete walls, his name fading into institutional anonymity, his story stripped of power by repetition and routine. No one would fear him there. No one would trust him either. His world had narrowed to scheduled movements and controlled spaces, a fitting end for someone who had exploited the openness of ordinary life. And yet, even that punishment felt insufficient to some, because no sentence could restore the years he had stolen simply by remaining silent. Across the city, other cold cases waited, names written on folders, lives paused in midair, families still caught between hope and resignation. Laura Whitman's case became a symbol for them, a reminder that silence does not always mean absence, that answers can survive decades underground, dormant but intact, waiting for the right moment to surface. It offered hope, but a tempered hope, one that acknowledged the cost of waiting. For the community, the legacy of the case was not fear but vigilance, not paranoia but a sharper awareness of how easily assumptions can blind, how comfort can dull curiosity, how trust, while necessary, should never replace attention. People learned to ask better questions, not just of others, but of their own certainty. On anniversaries, there were no ceremonies, no official statements, just small, private gestures, a candle lit, a pause taken, a thought held a little longer than usual. Laura did not need a spectacle. She needed to be remembered as more than the way her story ended. The files would remain archived, the evidence cataloged, the transcripts stored in databases that would outlive everyone involved. Future investigators would access them with a few keystrokes, studying the case as history, as precedent, as proof that persistence sometimes pays off. They would see the conclusion. They would not feel the waiting. And maybe that was the final truth of it. That cold cases are not defined by their endings, but by the space between the moment a life is disrupted and the moment the world finally understands why. That space is filled with uncertainty, with speculation, with the slow erosion of hope, and even when answers arrive, that space does not disappear. It becomes part of the story. Laura Whitman lived next door to her killer. The case was solved. But the question it left behind still lingered in every quiet street, every familiar face, every place that felt safe simply because it always had. How well do we really know the lives that unfold right beside our own? And how many truths are hiding in plain sight, waiting patiently for time to run out on silence? Even after everything had been named, labeled, sentenced, there was a quieter truth that refused to stay contained, a truth that surfaced not in courtrooms or case files, but in the private moments when people realized how deeply the story had settled into them, because some cases do not end, they disperse, dissolving into the collective awareness like smoke that lingers long after the fire is out. In the city, life continued with mechanical precision. Morning traffic surged. Coffee shops filled. Sirens cut through the air and faded again. But beneath the familiar rhythm, something had shifted. People paused a second longer before trusting first impressions. They watched patterns more closely. They listened with a sharper ear. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. Recognition that danger does not always arrive announced, and that safety is often assumed rather than verified. Laura Whitman's name became one of those names that surface unexpectedly, mentioned in quiet conversations, cited in lectures, whispered in passing when someone talked about cold cases finally breaking open. Each time, her story carried the same unsettling weight, not because of the violence itself, but because of how ordinary everything around it had been. No dark alley. No dramatic warning signs. Just a routine day that slipped into disappearance without resistance. The house on Alder Street stood unchanged, its walls holding no memory, its rooms unaware of the role they had played. New owners rearranged furniture, repainted walls, celebrated milestones inside a space that once absorbed secrets without protest. Buildings do not carry guilt. They simply remain. It is people who inherit the understanding, people who must decide what to do with it. For investigators across the country, the case continued to echo. It influenced how they approached stalled files, how they questioned assumptions that had gone unchallenged for years. Familiar names were no longer exempt from scrutiny. Proximity was no longer considered protection. The phrase, "we already looked there," lost its authority. Laura's case had quietly rewritten the rules. Families still waiting for answers followed the story closely. Some felt hope stir for the first time in years. Others felt a sharper pain, knowing that not every case would be granted the same convergence of evidence and timing. Cold cases, they understood, do not all awaken. Some remain dormant forever, not because the truth is gone, but because the path to it has eroded beyond recovery. The detective, long removed from official duty, occasionally received messages from younger officers asking about the case, about the waiting, about how it felt when the truth finally surfaced. He never romanticized it. He spoke about patience, about restraint, about learning to live with uncertainty without surrendering to it. He told them that the hardest part was not solving the case, but carrying it unsolved for so long without letting it harden you. Ellison's existence faded further into obscurity. His days blended together, stripped of significance, his name appearing only in records and occasional footnotes. History had reduced him to a function, an answer to a question that no longer needed elaboration. He was no longer the center of the story. He was a detail, and that, perhaps, was the most fitting outcome of all. Laura remained the absence around which everything else had reorganized. An absence that taught lessons. An absence that reshaped procedures. An absence that reminded people how easily trust can be misplaced when familiarity is mistaken for safety. Her life, interrupted but not erased, continued to influence the world in ways she would never witness. Late at night, on streets that looked calm and harmless, porch lights still glowed, shadows still stretched across sidewalks, and doors still closed with a quiet confidence of routine. Somewhere in that normalcy lived the lingering question the case refused to silence, the question that followed every solved cold case like an echo. How many stories are unfolding unnoticed right now? How many truths are sitting next door? And how long will they remain invisible, not because no one cares, but because no one thinks to look twice? The file was closed. The sentence was served. The case was solved. But the unease it revealed remained, woven permanently into the fabric of ordinary life, a reminder that the most unsettling mysteries are not the ones hidden far away, but the ones breathing quietly beside us, waiting for time, chance, and attention to finally intersect. And until they do, silence keeps its secrets well.